So, welcome everyone. My name is Ian Stewart. I am the Associate Director of the International Studies Institute, and I am not going to be doing the introductions, but I'm going to do some thank yous and then pass things over to Jamie Nunez, who is going to introduce our speaker today. First person I'd like to thank is Raul, who is here all the way from Mexico via Zoom. Thank you very much. And we're thrilled to have him here to join in our fall lecture series with the International Studies Institute. I want to thank Jamie for putting this series together and collecting all the speakers. And of course, our director from the ISI at UNM is Stephen Bishop. Lecture series right now and everyone's struggling in academia, so money is a real issue. So I want to make sure that we point out thanks to all of our financial sponsors who helped us put on this series. They include the Latin American and Iberian Institute at UNM, Sustainability Program at UNM, the Grand Challenges Grant Program, the Department of Political Science, and finally the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. I also want to very quickly thank Loyola Chastain, who is our administrative assistant and is behind the scenes who makes sure everything runs smoothly. So thank you all. And on that note, I also thank everyone who's joining us today for today's talk. I really appreciate your tuning in. And on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Jamie to introduce our speaker.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Nunez. I am a professor of political science, assistant professor of political science here at UNM. And I'm teaching a class on the politics of water, which many of you are joining from. And
Lucy? I can't see it for Lucy.
Hang on a second. And just lost my screen. I am just absolutely thrilled to welcome today Dr. Raul Pacheco-Vega to speak with us about his work. He is an associate professor at the Methods Lab at Flaxo, or is it Flaxo Sede?
Flaxo.
Yeah. His research, and I culled this from your website, but I think it's worded so well. Focuses on the spatial, political, and human dimensions of public service delivery from a comparative perspective. And he's worked on a wide array of water-related and environmental issues, taking on topics that need more attention, such as electronic waste governance, intractable water conflicts, as we were talking about earlier, and the politics of waste picking and its implications for vulnerable and highly marginalized communities. Today, he's presenting on the politics of bottled water, bringing attention to how the development of the bottled water industry is a political phenomenon that really merits more critical scrutiny. For me and for many political scientists and academics, I'd say more broadly, Dr. Pacheco-Vega's contributions reach beyond that of his scholarly work. His blogs, his tweets provide creative ideas on how to organize, tackle research, how to sharpen your writing skills. A shout out to the graduate students on the line, and even how to be a better and more humane colleague, really. So his energy, his patience, his relatability, they're just so nice to be around. So particularly in a challenging semester that we're all trying to get through. So thank you so much, Dr. Pacheco-Vega, for coming and sharing your time with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining me. I'm going to share my screen right now, and I'm going to start my talk. Many of you may have seen in sort of the flyer that I was going to talk about the comparative politics of Mexico and France regarding, bottled water. But as I was preparing my slides, what I thought was that I needed to put into context why bottled water is a political phenomenon and why is it important that we study bottled water. So I want to thank also the sponsors of this talk. And I hope that I cited all of them in my screen right now. And if I didn't, I apologize, and I will try to make sure not to mention them soon. One of the things that I do when I give talks is that I always allow people to live tweet my talk. So if you want to do so, you can do that by, including a quotation of my talk, and then my Twitter account, which is at Raul Pacheco, and then the hashtag BWPoliticsRPP, which is bottled water politics, and then my initials. You can look at one example on the screen. I also want to thank Dr. Jamie Nelson Nunez, the International Studies Institute, the Latin American and Iberian Institute of New Mexico, and all additional sponsors A lot of friends, colleagues, co-authors, and collaborators in the water world. There are too many to mention, so I'm not going to go one by one. My current and former students, those who study water conflict and those who study bottled water, and for funding not only the University of New Mexico, but also the George M. Story Distinguished Lectureship at Memorial University of Newfoundland, which I held last fall, and also l'Institut d'études d'Amérique latine at Université de Savoir Nouvelle at Paris 3 in France, and the Ohio State University Department of Political Science. So those three institutions invited me to give this talk, and they invited me to give not this talk, but a different version of this talk. And their funding has allowed me to do thinking around these areas. And obviously, I want to thank Paris in France for providing me an amazing context to research and write a large portion of the material that I'm presenting in this talk. Last year, I spent my sabbatical at Savoir Nouvelle, and I had the opportunity to do research on the politics of water more broadly, and specifically the politics of bottled water and privatization of water in France. And specific, more, my case study is on Paris. So there are three key areas of analysis of bottled water as a bottled science problem. One is that bottled water can be a political and a public policy problem. The second one is that there are ethical issues with consuming and producing bottled water. And the third one is the governance of plastic discards. What happens once we decide to when we finish drinking a bottle of water and then we discard what the container? It has implications, and those implications are also political. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, but I consider myself primarily a political scientist. So I am writing this particular talk from the perspective of a political scientist who does comparative politics, international relations, and public policy and public administration. Now, my key area in this talk is going to be bottled water as a political and public policy problem, leaving the ethics of consuming and producing bottled water and the governance of plastic discards to the question and answer segment if there are any questions on these specific topics, or for maybe another talk. Each one of them could be a 1 hour talk, and I'm going to try to be done in about 40 minutes so that we can have at least 20 minutes for conversation, if not a little bit more. I know that this goes to 5:45, but I just want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion. So the first question that comes to mind is, does bottled water have politics? And the first time I approached this issue, I looked at the work of Langdon Winner, who says, do artifacts have politics? And in this article, Winner says that in controversies about technology and society, there is no idea more provocative than the notion that technical things have political qualities. At issue is the claim that the machines, structures, and systems of modern material culture can accurately be judged, not only for their contributions of efficiency and productivity, not merely for their positive and negative environmental side effects, but also for the ways in which they can embody specific forms of power and authority. And to those of us who are political scientists, power and authority are sort of, the big markers of political phenomena. These are obviously my emphasis. So water, and specifically bottled water, embodies power and authority elements, which also, I argue, makes bottled water political. As to regard to power, who owns the water? Who controls who can access water? Who gets to enjoy its consumption? Who is excluded from consuming it? And how much water is allocated by whom and to whom? So if you control water, you can control people. And this is a really important element of political life that I want to highlight. one of the recent water conflicts in northern Mexico, in the Mexico-U.S. border, is the La Cuchilla Dam, and that dam serves a number of farmers in Chihuahua in northern Mexico. But it also provides some of the water that the 1944 treaty between the US and Mexico indicates that Mexico needs to repay the United States. Because of that, the allocation of water has created extreme conflicts, so much so that there have been protests that led to the killing of at least two people, one woman and one man, from what I heard, and I've been following this particular case. This is not the only case of water conflict, but it is one of the most iconic, one that shows that those who control water can also control people and can also get to exclude those that they chose. So governments, by virtue of providing water or excluding participants from, or populations from enjoying water, can also control it. This is something I want to include in my talk as one of the two cornerstones. The second one is authority. So who gets to decide how much water is allocated and how much are you paying for water? Who gets to collect the money from consumers and how is the money reallocated, distributed, spent, and accounted for? So if you are a government agency that is in charge of water, so you're a water utility, then you get to decide how much water is allocated across cities. If you are a water authority at the federal level, like it happens in Mexico with the National Water Commission, you get to decide who gets to exploit water and who gets to extract it by providing licenses. And I just want to mention the case of Mexico, because according to the Mexican Constitution, in Article 27, water is the property of the nation. So the water authority, so the Federal Water Authority, only provides licenses for exploiting wells and water bodies. It does not provide licenses indefinitely because it doesn't exchange the rights to water. So it's only a right to make use of the water. And the third issue that I present under the heading of authority is who is responsible for ensuring the human right to water for everyone. And this is a particularly important issue to understand, because the human right to water as an ideal and as an international norm is very laudable, but there are technical details at the ground level, and I am a chemical engineer originally before my PhD, so I am aware of the technicalities of having to provide water for everyone. It's not cheap, it's not easy, and it has challenges. And it's not just so easy as to declare the human right to water, but it also makes it important that we realize that water is not only a human right, but also it has other properties that are political. So water is a resource governance problem. From a resource governance problem, water is a common that is shared, exhaustible, to which many people can access, and without any rules for shared and reasonable consumption, these reservoirs can be depleted. But it also can be considered a human right because of the United Nations resolution of July of 2010 that says that all humans have a right to access at least 50 liters of water per day per person. That is a statement and that is an international norm, but there are technicalities as to how we put it into place at the domestic level and at the local level. However, through the years, we have somehow shifted to make a commodity. So there have been efforts to privatize water supply and commodify them, transforming them from a commons into a commodity. So water is no longer only a human right or a commons, but it also is merchandise. Now, I want to just zero in on something that those of us who study economics and political science have well known. There are 4 types of 4 categories of public goods. Goods that are rigorous in consumption and that you can exclude from access are private goods. Those who they are not rigorous like pure public goods and that are non-excludable are goods that to which everyone has access, but even if other people have access to those goods, everybody else can consume them, right? Like one pure public good is air. The fact that you all are breathing doesn't preclude me from breathing because even though it's just one big, body of air in the planet, it's non-rigorous. And I cannot prevent you from breathing air because that's not a good that is excludable. However, water, fisheries, fish, land, and forests are goods that are subject to congestion or common pool resources. They are rigorous in consumption. If you consume water, that's water that I no longer am going to be able to consume. And they're non-excludable. If we are all accessing, for example, just one container of water, there will be one point where there will be no more water to allocate. So as more people consume it, it gets depleted faster. So water is a CPR, a common pool resource, or a good subject to congestion. So how did we get to the point where water, which is a good that is subject to congestion, has now acquired market properties, thereby becoming a commodity? And can this approach of commodifying water work in a context of an international norm of the human right to water? So this talk problematizes precisely those questions. This is a graph that shows on the x-axis years starting in 2008 and ending in 2018, and on the y-axis is the number of liter per capita per person. So the global average per capita consumption grew from 29.9 from 30 liters of bottled water at the global average to 52, so almost doubled. 2.5 times. And this is important that we consider, right? Because this growth has actually had influence in how much water is being allocated to other uses, right? So the water that bottling companies extract from aquifers is no longer available for other uses. And this has led to increasing conflict. At the top, the country where I live and my parents are from, Mexico, it's at the top of liters per capita per year of the top 10 leading countries in consumption. In 2018, it was tied with Thailand. I think in 2019 grew a little bit more, but it has always remained either in the first or the second place. Now, if you see, France is the 5th top consumer of bottled water with 144 liters per person per year. And this is very weird because in France, there is such good domestic water treatment that you could drink water from the tap, and yet French people drink bottled water. And I will explain a little bit of the history of why this is the case and why France, the comparative politics of this is fascinating because in Mexico, you could argue that there is no infrastructure and there is a weak regulatory regime that leads to the dominance of bottled water. But in France, that's not the case. The infrastructure is extremely good, and yet it's still a country where there's a lot of bottled water. So bottled water offers really weird paradoxes because packaging water democratized access to mineral water. Before, mineral springs, water with healing properties, were only accessible to the bourgeoisie. However, being able to purchase bottled water enabled those who were not bourgeoisie to access this special healing water. So this is a really paradoxical phenomenon. If you think about it in the current times, bottled water denies access to water to other people. But in the 1700s and 1800s, it actually democratized access to healing water. So this is one of the many paradoxes that bottled water presents. Bottled water is also a global environmental governance paradox because at the same time, this is a human right. It has grown to become one of the most profitable industries globally, with a 275 billion US dollar per year as of 2018, with a 22 profit margin. The only industry that is more profitable is the publication of journal articles. So we need to start thinking about it and doing some collective action work on this. So my argument is that producing bottled water is akin to commodifying the human right to water. And as a matter of fact, that's the summary of my talk. Because given that water characteristics are primarily as a common pool resource, we have paradoxically transformed it into a commodity that is extracted, traded, and distributed across the globe. You may have found in airports Fiji water. You may also find distributed in your hometowns. You may find that Perrier is also distributed. So you have bottled water has this what I call a transnational life. But the global rise of bottled water offers a second level challenge for those of us who do political science and public policy, which is how can governments ensure that every individual at the subnational level can have access to enough of the vital liquid to survive and thrive without blocking industrial production of packaged water. So a lot of people have asked me, do you want to end the global bottled water industry? And I am not going to go into that today, but I'm going to advance just part of my argument on this. I do not want to shut the global bottled water industry because there are instances where you do need bottled water. I just don't want it to be such a business that it becomes a primary activity across the globe, right? I want people to have universal access, and bottled water does present some challenges to this universal access to water. So this leads into my newest book project, which is going to be published next year by Edward Elgar. It's a single author manuscript that describes essays on the global, comparative, and domestic politics of bottled water, where I discuss bottled water as a public policy problem. I discuss the comparative politics of domestic water consumption across 4 countries. I also discuss the ethics of bottled water production and consumption and how activism against bottled water and for tap water happens in Canada and the US. And I also talk about bottled water in Mexico as a case study. There are 2 interrelated bodies, and this is important for those who are students of politics and IR, that are applicable to the study of bottled water. And public policy and public administrations are too, but I just wanted to mention 2 that I discuss in my book, which is the comparative politics of bottled water consumption and the comparative politics of the actual infrastructure of bottled water and the regulatory approach to governing bottled water. In international relations, geopolitics can give you some idea of how to study bottled water as a source of international and transnational conflict. We can look at international political economy, and we can also look at global markets where packaged water trading occurs. More interestingly, and this is something I've been doing some work on, is the norm diffusion or non-diffusion of the human right to water. So is that conflicting with bottled water acceptance at the global level? I also do some work on the role of states in governing bottled water, the role of non-state actors, and I also do some comparative environmental activism work. So why does bottled water exist? Because it's readily available. Plastic has made packaged water easy to transport and consume. Because it is healthy and it is pure. And if you remember Jane Fonda actually made consuming bottled water popular as well. Because cities cannot provide tap water of proper quality. And this is one of the mechanisms of reverse quarantine, where instead of protecting, since the government cannot protect you, you protect yourself by consuming bottled water. Because we've developed a taste for it, there are actually sommeliers for bottled water, and there are gourmet bottled waters, as Andrew Barrio has shown. But my argument says that bottled water exists because regulatory regimes are very weak. So, yes, there is a need for bottled water in some ways, but also it's not regulated. And because it's not regulated and the governance is weak, that makes it super easy to enter the global bottled water market at the domestic and international scales. So bottled water is a bright problem for social science and humanities research. And I'm gonna go a little bit faster because I don't have a megaton of time. So I just want to make sure that I show you this slide that I created based on the work of Sophie Elmhurst. And this focuses primarily in Europe, but if you see, Harrogate produced the first commercial British bottled water in the 1700s, and so did Perrier as well. Perrier also operated around that time. Um, in in the early 1900s, Alexander Cruikshank Houston implemented the first extended chlorination of a public water supply, partly as a response to other to epidemics that have happened before. And in the United States, Jersey City became the first US city to use full-scale chlorination. Harrogate grew to become the largest exporter of bottled water in the 1940s, but I want to call your attention on specifically how in the 1970s, the introduction of polyethylene created an opportunity, an open opportunity to increase the accessibility of bottled water, which also coincided with the successful marketing campaigns by Perrier. So water became not only easy to transport, but also healthy. And in 1994, Aquafina entered the market. Now the global market is led by PepsiCo, Nestle, and Coca-Cola. These are the three major agents. So because of that, I argue that bottled water is political and a public policy problem that deserves more scrutiny and attention. Now, I want to call your attention to the case of Mexico, because in the case of Mexico, there are certain dates that have changed how bottled water is consumed. Other scholars have argued that the introduction of bottled water was the result of the earthquake in Mexico City, which destroyed the infrastructure of drinking water. That is one factor. It's true. Actually, ironically, September 19, 1985 is my birthday. So I have been my birthday lands on the two worst earthquakes in Mexico, which is not very fun if you want your birthday to be celebrated. But in the 1990s, the cholera epidemic motivated people to seek safe drinking water sources because their water infrastructure was not robust enough. Nestle entered also the bottled water market around that time. But if you notice, and I want you to just zero in on 1991, the Mexican federal government for the first time recommended to its citizens that they seek safe water from private sources. So in fact, it's not only the cholera, it's not only the fact that there was an earthquake, but also the fact that the government actually conspired and inserted themselves into the game, into the political game, by ensuring that citizens, instead of actually complying with their mandate to provide safe water to everyone, CONAGUA sent the actual consumption to the decision of consuming safe water to the public. So they made a public decision, they made it private. And this also coincided 10 years later with the entry of Coca-Cola Company, who happens to be the president of Mexico in 2000. Yes, the former CEO of FEMSA in Mexico, Vicente Fox. And that's actually when the growth in bottled water consumption actually shot up. So in 2011, Mexico became the main consumer of Coca-Cola, and in 2014, the largest consumer of bottled water. So my work sheds light on the actual history and politics of bottled water in Mexico. Now, I want to just zero in on the conceptual model that I use to on water governance, in market interventions in water governance. Here, I talk not about privatization of water utilities, not about marketization, which is the creation of water trading permits and water markets, but about commodification, which is when multinational or domestic corporations undertake the commodification of water resources in the form of soda or bottled water. So how can we govern bottled water in a country where municipal water supply is not trusted, and what does implementing the human right to water paradigm entail for the bottled water industry in Mexico? And from a local perspective, there are obviously public health concerns and also some hydration and luxury consumption, as well as discussions on the ethical and luxury brand marketing and days of access. But local governments in Mexico are responsible for providing safe drinking water, but financial concerns have led municipalities to privatize their water supply. Not only that, the fact that there is no regulatory framework for extraction and consumption of water has changed the dynamics of extraction, packaging, and consumption. So it's more bottled water permissible within the context of a water insecure city? My answer is that it depends. And it depends on how you define a water insecure city, what goals you have, and if your goal is to become a water-centric city, where water is conservation, consumption, but also can be a business. It is challenging, and I know this because I've had a lot of participation in international conferences. It is challenging to use human right to water as a policy frame, and I'm going to try to close in my talk a little bit faster. But these are four of the main questions, five of the main questions. Who pays for water? Who is responsible for paying for water? And what happens with those who abuse water consumption and should be overconsumption be rewarded? Also, what happens with those who do not live within urban limits consumption? All of these questions create a paradox for regulatory approaches and public policy approaches. So I just want to mention that there are the human right to water as far as access, sanitation, and quality is very, spotty in Latin America. As you can see in Mexico, it's constitutional, but water quality is not mandated at the constitutional level. So this leads to the creation of informal water markets that lead to public health concerns and inclusive commodification of the human right to water. Bottled water is regulated in the US and Canada by, as far as the US Food and Drugs Agency as food, and in Mexico just for health purposes, but there is not this classification obscures the realities of extraction, packaging, and distribution. So the reality is a lot more complex in regards to regulation. So there is no clear understanding of negative impacts on water wells. There are no sanctions towards the extractive industries. We solely focus on human health concerns that obscure the realities of ecosystem health, and alternative water uses also become problematic. So to understand urban water governance, we need to include the bottled water industry business in this conversation. So in conclusion, and I want to conclude now so that we can have some time for questions and answers. Implementing the human right to water is definitely not as easy as we might to or want to believe that it is, particularly in a context of commodification. Who gets to actually decide how much water is allocated to bottled water companies and how much is allocated to domestic consumption, particularly in cities that are increasingly growing, as Mexican cities are, as French cities are? I mean, Paris cannot grow as the city, but the banlieue continues to grow, and there's an increasing number of people in the city. So we also need to consider that. We also need an interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, open and honest discussion about what it would take to modernize water supply in Mexico and around the globe. My argument is that if we do have better infrastructure for tap water treatment, it is unlikely that there will be a lot of people who will be drinking bottled water. And finally, bottled water, regardless of its global dimension, it's also a local business and also needs to be included in the conversation. That means that no, just activism is not going to shape the way in which water is consumed and allocated, but it's also part of a much larger discussion and needs to be included as well. More things that I'm thinking about governance spider webs like overlapping regulations, jurisdictions, regulatory mismatch, and regulatory capture. They present challenges for urban water governance in Mexico and the global south, of which Latin American cities are also part of these. There's the creation of informal bottled water markets. Now we have pirated bottled water that has the label of Nestle, of Danone, and so on, but it's actually created, extracted, and packaged in small houses in Mexico. This is not only in Mexico. I was doing some field work in Bogota last year, and it also happens there as well. And it also opens questions around the ethics of bottled water and consuming, producing, and regulating ethical bottled water. So this is part of some work that I'm also doing with Christiana Center at Fordham University. Thank you. So let's hear some questions. Here are my contact details, and that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. We're just like, we get to see the little icons jump up of the applause. I really appreciate the time, and we definitely we have a good chunk of time for questions. And so I'd like to invite people to signal me or to write some questions into the chat. It's sort of your choice. I guess I can maybe sort of to give some people some time here. I'd like to maybe start off with like kind of personalizing this research agenda, just to ask you a question about how did this project come to be? What motivated your interest, and how, right, has it seems like it's morphed into a much broader topic. And so if you could tell me a little bit about, or tell us all a little bit about the research agenda and how it developed. Maybe we can start from there, and then it looks like we've got questions queuing up for you.
Perfect. I'll be happy to entertain questions. So this is quite interesting. Jamie, thank you so much for asking this question. As it turns out, when I was a grad student, Elinor Ostrom and Vincent, I did my PhD at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, in Canada. And Lynn and Vincent Ostrom came to UBC to be visiting professors. So I took them out for lunch after a seminar, and we were having lunch, and I was like, well, I'll invite the Ostroms for lunch. You can imagine a grad student, super, my contact details back up on the screen. Yes. So what I'll do is I'll put my contact details up right now, and then I can answer the questions alongside my conversation. So I can give my, so yes, so I was having lunch with Lynn and Vincent Ostrom, and we had a fantastic time. Lunch became a walk throughout the UBC campus, which became dinner, which then I took them out again for a walk around the woods. And at some point over lunch, Lynn turned to Vincent and said, Vincent, we study normal Ostroms, like the regular commons, right? Like we study water and land and so on. Nobody studies the weird commons, like the unorthodox commons, right? Like wastewater, or maybe even bottled water. And she said, I think Raul should study wastewater governance from a commons theory perspective. And Vincent turns to Lynn, like these, I'm sitting right here, right in front of them, like they're having a conversation among themselves. And Vincent is like, yep, you're right. This is something nobody has studied. So I think Raul should study the governance of wastewater using commons theory and so on. And right there and then, my research agenda was created. Lynn and Vincent decided that it was up to them to decide my academic career, which I have absolutely no problem with. I love them dearly. And then I went to do my postdoc with them at Indiana University at the Ostrom workshop. So and I stayed in touch until they both passed away. So, and that's how I came to do this. So these are, I study the governance of unorthodox commons, right? Like the commons that have regular value are commons that we value intrinsically, right? Like we value water, and water is important for human life. So we all want to have access to water. We value forests because forests are also um, a good that give us access to furniture. They also are recreational. They have so many uses, so many ecosystem service use. We we value land, and we all want a house, a dog, a white fence, and 2.52 children, right? Like, these are valuable common pool resources or valuable commons. These are orthodox commons. The commons that I study are commons that are unorthodox. So those are valued because of the work we put into give them value. So for example, wastewater is not valuable itself, but as a chemical engineer, I can tell you that wastewater becomes valuable once you treat it, because you can use the biosolids, and also the heat that comes out of the water can be also used in heat exchangers, right? So wastewater itself is not valuable, but what is valuable is is the value that we put into these commons. We all wanted to access wastewater once we discovered that there is value to it, as well as, and I'm going to stop sharing screen right now just so that, let me see, stop share. Okay. So, I mean, you revalue wastewater and you revalue solid waste, and bottled water is valued because of the bottle that we put into it, right? Like, because of the fact that we put it into polyethylene bottle, and then we exchange it and trade it and add a markup. That's how they're valued. So these are unorthodox commons, and that's how I came to study bottled water. But Lynn and Vincent both were political scientists. They were not economists, even though Lynn was the first woman to win the Economics Nobel Prize. But their political science was geared towards the study of public problems and towards public administration. Lynn's doctoral dissertation is a problem of public administration governance, right? Like the governance of aquifers. So, okay. So I'm gonna look at questions. The contact screen, yes. So I hope that everybody, I will put it up at the end of the talk for a few minutes, at the end of the question and answer period, in case anybody missed them. So I also have, I can put my email address here on the chat, and I'll look into reading some questions and then answering them. My website is also here. And for those of you who are in a situation of thesis, I do write a lot of resources. So my resources are usually either under my blog or also under I do academic writing and live as well. So if you're interested, you can also look at them under these three web pages. My publications are also on my website. I have most publications open access. So, hi, Dr. Pacheco-Vega. Thank you for the talk. I might have missed this, but what kind of regulatory regimes over bottled water were you proposing, like price control, improving tap water quality? So there are a number of regimes. One of these regulatory, this is an excellent question. So one of these regulatory regimes would be governing and having strong regulations as to the water balance in a particular community. So for example, in Michigan, there are bottling companies in Maine. So how can you bottle water in Michigan when people in Flint do not have access to water, right? So we need an ethical framework that governs how much water is accessed and where, a bottling plant can be located or not. Also, price controls only work when the population is sensitive to price. If they're not sensitive to price, as it happens with the case in Mexico, for example, and I'm going to go outside of bottled water into soda pop, into Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has a soda tax, and yet people continue consuming Coca-Cola. So that means that the demand is inelastic, right? So they still want to consume it even though the price rises. How would I propose to create clear communication between various institutions and government agencies involved in providing water in a service sector for citizens? Wow, what a great question. I think one of the biggest challenges in the water governance domain, in the water domain, particularly in Latin America, is the global distrust. So, activists do not trust the government, activists do not trust industries. And so there's always this, very, confrontational approach. And I study cooperation. Ever since I met, actually, before I even met Elinor Ostrom and Vincent Ostrom, I studied cooperation. I studied water conflict because I'm interested not in the conflict. I'm interested in the cooperation across agents. That's what makes me excited. That's what my work has been all over my life, right? Like when I was a chemical engineer, I did wastewater treatment using bacteria that cooperated among each other to degrade municipal water. When I did my master's in economics of technical change, my master's is a game theory project where I looked at how different pharmaceutical companies could collaborate with large biotech company, with large pharma, small biotech, with large pharma. And then for my doctoral dissertation, I studied water. I studied water and water treatment in the tanning industry in León and Guadalajara. But I studied it because the tanning industry is also associated and very tightly connected with the shoe industry. So you cannot shut down the tanning industry without affecting the footwear industry. So these are so interconnected that there needs to be some cooperation. So this is, I'm interested in the cooperation. So I think the first issue is always building trust. That's what I would always say. Building trust, building a collaborative approach where government agencies at all three levels collaborate with activists and with industry representatives for a much more sustainable water governance regime. So I have another question. People in France buy bottled water because it's a luxury brand marketing despite quality tap water. That's part of the reason, and also part of the reason is the portability, right? Like you are on the road because and this is very specific to Paris, but I also did some field work around the country itself. But it's very disposable. Also, it's it's a brand marketing exercise. You're drinking Perrier, you're drinking Evian. Evian is so pure. Like the water from your tap may not be so pure, but look, drink Evian. It's very peculiar because I went to that region of France, to Evian, and people are proud of actually being the producers of these Vichy, the Vichy region. They're proud of having their water bottled. This happened to me also in Spain with Aquapana, and in Italy with Aquapana. In Spain, there's another brand that is escaping my mind right now. But yeah, there are countries and that are where their populations are very proud that the government, not the government, but a company is extracting their water, packaging it, and selling it. When I did field work in Venice, it was bizarre to see them so proud of their bottled water. It was really insane. But yes, that's very much part of the reason. So is bottled water branding always political in nature? In some markets, it's definitely is. However, do you believe it is political in nature regardless of country? these are fantastic questions, and I will save the chat. And if I don't have the right to save the chat, I will. Oh yes, I can save the chat. So I will save the chat because these are outstanding questions that I plan to address in my book. Um, Bottled water branding has political undertones, right? And it has political undertones because it always branding is always associated with the detraction of the quality of urban services. So, for example, in Mexico, there's a brand that says this is pure water, like clean water. Whatever water you get out of the government is bad, but this is clean water. And Gerber, for example, which is a brand of Nestle, Gerber says that they create water that is specific for your baby. Now, I have no idea how Gerber has made it possible to change, two hydrogen and one oxygen molecule to make them so perfect that they're custom made for each baby in the planet. But, that's ridiculous marketing, right? So I do believe that it is political, but each one will change depending on the country as well. For example, as I was mentioning the case of France, in France, Perrier is very well known and very well sold because everybody loves Perrier. But in Mexico, I mean, have you all watched the Devil Wears Prada? If you watch the very first few scenes, you will see the assistant of Miranda Priestley opening a bottle of Perrier. They don't show the actual label, but the bottle is so distinctive that you do know that Miranda Priestley, the editor in chief of Runway, the best fashion magazine in the United States, is a drinker of Perrier. So this, I love it. I used to model before, so anything that has to do with fashion and modeling and so on just excites me. But it also reminded me that bottled water is political because Miranda doesn't drink tap water. Miranda doesn't drink, you know, um, Aquafina. Miranda drinks Perrier, which is French. Where does she go for the global fashion show? She goes to Paris for Paris Fashion Week, where I was, by the way. It was outstanding. So yes, I do believe that it is political in nature. And thank you so much, everyone, for your questions.
We have two more questions one from Stephen Bishop and one from Ian Stewart. And keep them coming in the chat or flag me if you're interested. Stephen?
Okay. So, I mean, I've got like 3 questions, but I'm just going to pick one here. So I'm interested about how you're proposing to discuss this type of issue from a human rights perspective. That seems to me really innovative and exciting, but I'm wondering at the same time how effective it can be in certain areas. So for example, I've lived in Cameroon in Central Africa several different times, and I've seen a stunning rise in the use of bottled water. 22 years ago, you basically never saw it. 5 years ago and last year, every store's got just bricks upon bricks of this bottled water. And a large part of the reason is that the government has just not maintained the water system. And the water makes lots of people sick now. I mean, I could drink the water 22 years ago. I can't anymore, and a lot of people can. So I could imagine someone, a Cameroonian individual, or even the international community accusing the Cameroonian government of a human rights violation for not maintaining their water system, their water distribution system. And yet, Cameroon's got a lot of quote unquote bigger human rights problems. Okay, unnecessary jailings. There's a low grade civil war going on right now, quite frankly. So I'm just wondering, would people laugh at the idea, in a country like Cameroon with these jailings and killings and so forth, would it work to be accusing the government of human rights violations in terms of water?
So this is a really good question. I don't know the Cameroonian context, but I do know that the human right to water frame is challenged as a useful frame. A lot of people say this is not useful, right? Like um, you know, yes, you have the human right to water, but I do not have enough money to pay for it. However, and let me just flip the coin of a very controversial case. In Nairobi, in Kenya, a number of economists decided to do a field experiment, an RCT, shutting down the provision of water to poor people in slums. And they were surprised that there was an uprising of people on Twitter. This happened to me. I was one of the people who complained because this is something that apparently the Kenyan government, the Nairobi government, was going to do anyway. Now, if you studied Cameroon, you probably know that in some countries of the global south, many countries of the global south, particularly in Africa, there is what Alicia Hunt called forbearance, right? Like that's the intentional and temporary um, dereliction of duty of making regulating something to provide social goods, right? So in this case, Nairobi Water was not willing to cut citizens, delinquent citizens who would not pay their water bills because of fear precisely of that particular phenomenon, right? Like the fact that water is a human right. And with this intervention, these economists decided to try to demonstrate that yes, you can, in fact, deny water to poor slums in Kenya, in Nairobi, and still get away with it and not create political uprising, right? That's the result. Basically, I hope I'm not misattributing their paper, but that's more or less give or take um, the gist of the paper, right? Like the problem is that it also had a negative and negative externality, a negative unintended effect. Some of the citizens whose households were shut off of water did not have water for 9 months. This was not a week. This was not, a month that could potentially be bearable, and it happens in many slums and even urban regions in developed countries. I mean, look at Flint. No, this happened for 9 months, right? Where the time that they were disconnected. So not having the human right to water frame actually could open a kind of worms, and it could open a Pandora's box by creating more of these types of interventions, right? Like where the regulation is so strict that yes, it can help with the sustainability of the water utility, but it also basically can negatively impinge on the rights of people to have access to water. This is why I do believe that it's hard to implement. I know this. I'm a chemical engineer. I understand the technology behind treating water and transporting it all over a city, right? But if we don't have this frame, then there is very little recourse for people to actually have the possibility of, suing the government for denying them the human right to water. And even then, the government wins. I'm following 3 cases in Mexico where 3 water utilities were successfully, so they were these water utilities in Hermosillo, Puebla, and Jesus Maria, close to where I live in Aguascalientes, where they shut off the water service of delinquent citizens, and yet, like, so non-payers, and yet the Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico said that the water utilities were in the right, even though the human right to water is encoded in the Mexican Constitution on Article 4 since 2012. This is absolute insanity. It is a human right, it's encoded in the Constitution, and even then, water utilities can still get away with shutting people off. So we need to be honest about, and create this conversation around, yes, how you can make a water utility sustainable, but also how can you make it so, so that it also provides the human right to water to people. I hope I answered the question. And I would love to hear your other questions. So please email them to me if you can.
Okay, Ian.
Okay, thank you. Raul, thank you so much for your talk. I found it fascinating. I want to know what you're drinking right now.
I am drinking actually tap water. I have a filter I'm at my mom's. I don't want to show it around, but this is my childhood room. So my mom is also a professor. So I have a home office in 50% of my room, and then I have my room. So it looks very professional because my mom got me this beautiful home office inside my room, but my room is over there. But yes, I am drinking tap water because both my mom and I have installed filters. So has my dad. My parents are divorced. My dad lives about 5 minutes away from here, so I installed the filter. But again, I have the technical expertise, right? Like I'm a chemical engineer, so I can.
Sure. And that was not actually my question. My question was very similar to along the lines of Dr. Bishop's question. We do normally have offices right across the hall from one another, so we think in similar vein. I was really curious, less of a question, more just for your insights on what happens when bottled water becomes a stateless issue. I mean, we're looking now at a world with somewhere around 79.5 million refugees between Venezuela, Central Africa, and Syria. And they totally depend. I was a foreign correspondent and visited so many refugee camps. They completely depend on bottled water from the UNHCR, from the World Health Organization. What happens for your parameters, the public policy question, the ethical question, and the environmental question? Who's accountable for those issues when it's a stateless issue?
That's a fantastic question, and I was told that the best way to demonstrate that you are an expert is actually say, I don't know. So I actually don't have a good answer to that question. But I could hypothesize something, right? Like there will be the problem with water, and particularly, my doctorate, I have a double doctorate in human geography and political science. And in political science, I actually have a double major in political science, in comparative politics and international relations. So that my professors of IR do not, berate me. Yes, there is a big issue of fragmentation of governance of water at the global level. UN water is not enough. UNESCO is not enough. The WHO is not enough, right? Like these mechanisms of coordination for global water are not enough. We do need a UN water that actually is a global institution of water governance, because what will happen is that in stateless, situations, somebody needs to be responsible for providing water to people, and there will with refugees and migrants, there will be a lot of people who will not have that right? And so it will be complicated. I do think that there is a need for a global water organization that can have that sort of power in extreme situations like the one that you're mentioning right now. I see three other questions that I would like to address. So how do sustainability efforts against plastic bottles help or hurt water access issues where bottled water is necessary? So this is one of the chapters in my book, and it's super interesting to see that there is substantial activism against bottled water, but it's very localized. So in Guelph, Wellington Water Watchers is a fantastic organization, and they've managed to make the city of Guelph in Canada, in Ontario, stop licenses of Nestle. So there's a lot of power now. How will that affect bottled water branding? I don't know if it will affect bottled water branding, but I'm gonna link that question to the last one that says, with an increase of reusable water bottles, how does the decrease of bottled water affect bottled water branding? And will institutions lose political power or implement other strategies to maintain political power? I actually think if bottled water decreases, then there will be a loss of power of political institutions. So this will be an interesting development. I mean, just the fact that Nestle is no longer as powerful in Ontario, Canada, um, has opened a kind of worms, because now activists have seen that yes, you can fight a global giant and be successful. So this is super interesting, super. It opens a fantastic kind of worms, and it also opens avenues for research with my students as well. So this is something I wanted to. My students will probably also continue my own work. So.
I think we have another question from Stephen Bishop. Bishop.
Okay, so I'm wondering, I understand the arguments against bottled water in terms of pricing and accessibility and governments not living up to their, basically their duty to provide a basic resource for their citizens. But I'm wondering if you've also encountered the following complaint, because I got to know an actual bottled water rights activist in Cameroon whose argument against bottled water was not based on any of those reasons. It was based on the fact that those bottles were thrown out, were dumped all over the city. And the biggest problem was, it wasn't just sort of generalized pollution or it being an eyesore, it was that they would get caught up in the little streams all around the city. They would clog those streams up, and then when there was a major rainstorm, those little streams would become, real torrents, and people would drown, especially kids, because they would have to cross these to go to school, to go to the market, whatever. So his argument that it was that it was literally a killer in a direct way. And I'm just wondering if that's something that was somehow unique to Cameroon, or if it's something that you've seen elsewhere.
I'm also muted, which happens all the time whenever I teach. So I'm not surprised that it happened to me at an important seminar. So thank you for this question. This is something, so I have a chapter in my book where I talk about the politics of discards, and another one where I talk about the activism. There's activism pro tap water, there's activism against bottled water, and they're not the same. So the activism against bottled water takes two forms. One of them is activism against the extraction of bottled water as an issue of human rights, and then the other one is the activism against bottled water discards. And bottled water discards do play an important role in the global plastics regime. The problem is that, you see them in the ocean, in the global garbage patch, and so on, but they sort of don't enter the imaginary of international organizations. What enters their imaginary, which is one of the reasons why activism against plastic bottles continues, is that at the global level, what enters the imaginary of international organizations and international institutions is beads, microbeads. So microplastics are in the imaginary of like the people in the global policy regimes for pollution think about plastic not as the bottle, even though they say, the global garbage patch, blah blah blah, in the Pacific, yes, but that's not what they're operating against. They're operating against actually not bottled water, but beads, microbeads. So this creates a problem because it's, the excuse for a global plastics regime is no longer bottled water or plastics. It's bottled water, plastics from bottled water. So bottled water discards. It's the very microscopic ones that come in shampoo and so on. This is important and it affects the politics because they're not visible, right? So the invisibility is what makes it important that we address this non-point source pollution. bottles are very visible. So this is a very weird, and I've interviewed people in the global plastics regime, and they're like, yeah, well, plastics from bottled water, sure, they're important, but think about microbeads. And I'm like, I know, but if you see them in the ocean, you will see bottles, right? Like they're physically there. So how can you not see them in international negotiations? So that's one of the reasons why activism against plastic discards remains, because they're for some bizarre reason not in the global imaginary. They're discussions that they're happening at the national level, and then they somehow disappear in the international environmental negotiations.
I know we're almost out of time. Let's see, we have a couple of, okay. I guess we don't have enough time for this question, but I just sort of wanted to put it out there that one of the sort of more interesting debates that I've run into is listening to people that worked at the World Bank sort of debate with some activist students at a symposium around whether or not Coca-Cola should play a role in the dialogue and even the creation of access to water. And so like Coca-Cola has been working on creating kiosks in areas that people don't have access to water. And I know we're like 2 seconds out of time, but I just kind of wondered about, I didn't realize like the political stronghold that Coca-Cola has in Mexico. And I just wondered if that's been something that you've really had to kind of engage, if that's sort of a backstory to some of the things that you're working on.
So I'm working on part of that. I'm also doing some work in Chiapas. So it's very weird how, the political stronghold. Vicente Fox was actually a classmate of my dad's. So I know him very well. Like I've known him my entire life. So it's really interesting how the politics of actual, also closeness plays out, because I've very openly criticized Vicente, but the worst time. So my phone. One of the reasons why I don't use WhatsApp and I use Telegram is because my phone has been tampered with, and it's very clear who it is, because it has also been tampered. Like the phone of an activist against Coca-Cola has also 3 of them have also been tampered with. It's a really with Pegasus, which is a software that is only used by governments. So this is quite scary. It's really funny because I knew that this was absolutely false because they talked about my wife and I'm gay. So there is absolutely no way that's going to happen. But it just creates avenues for one as a researcher to study very dark political phenomena. There's a lot of bottled water seems so neutral. And I'm going to close in full circle with Langdon Winner's quotation, right? Like, there is no such thing as an object that is not political, and bottled water is political.
Okay, great. I think that was like the perfect last words to the hour and 15 minutes. You've got snaps, you've got class. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you who tuned in. And if anybody has any additional questions, we've discussed your article in class. We will shoot them your way via email, but we are so grateful for your time, and thank you to ISI for making this all happen. So you all have a safe night, and then I'll stay on the line, Raul.
Yeah.
And the rest of you, we'll see you on Monday, if not before in office hours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marcel.
Thank you guys. Have a nice day.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Malcolm.